Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so this is kind of the moment we've been waiting for. We've been learning about use effect. We've been using use effect, but we've kind of just been simulating connecting our app to an API over the internet. We simulated that by using local storage, which is a database that's built into your browser that can save your state even when you refresh your page. But that is not like that's not like a full-on database. A typical database stores your information not even on your computer. It's on some server in the world. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be storing your data in an Airtable, which is kind of like a database. And yeah, kind of we've been making these use effects that simulate like we had like a set timeout which waits to simulate your app like loading for the data to come in. But yeah, here's where we're actually like filling in the last piece, which is actually using fetch to send and receive data from Airtable. Yeah, so this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a little refresher on asynchronous JavaScript. Then we're going to talk about fetch. We're going to briefly touch on what is an API. Then we're going to talk about API keys, environment variables, and secrets. This lecture isn't exactly structured the same way as the material at Code the Dream for this week. I think they had you learning about some things that were kind of different, but I'm mostly basing this off of what topics are coming up in the assignment that I think you need to know. So yeah, these are the most important concepts to get for the assignment, along with use effect. I could have probably put a use effect refresher in here, but I'll I've done a couple of videos at this point on use effect, so you can always go back and watch those. And I'll try to slow down and make it all understandable. And if anyone has any questions throughout, then feel free to ask and get on the mic to ask. You can ask in the comments, but I don't always notice. So yeah, and then at the end of going through these slides, I'm gonna do live coding and walk through the assignment. Okay, so let's start async refresher. So asynchronous code is to be compared with synchronous code. Synchronous is, you can think of it as like the normal code that you're used to writing, where it runs from start to finish. So one line runs and then the next and then the next, and it just runs from top to bottom, one line of code at a time. And it runs in a predictable order, just top to bottom, unless you have like if statements or functions or loops, which they can kind of alter the order that the code runs in. But ultimately, it runs in a predictable way at a predictable time. One line of code after the other, pretty much as fast as your CPU can run it. So your CPU is turning your code into the ones and zeros that actually result in kind of the inner workings of it all. Your code is being transpiled or compiled into individual instructions for your CPU, and it's just doing those as fast as it can, one at a time. That's what synchronous code is. And asynchronous code, it runs outside the usual flow. So it's some code that doesn't run in a predictable order that you expect. Well, it is, you can predict when it will run, but it's not like the usual way. It doesn't follow the usual rules. basically asynchronous code will wait for some other code to run, and then it runs. And it can even wait for an event that's outside of your program. So that's kind of the key thing, is that asynchronous code allows you to wait for some external thing to happen, like a user to click a button, or a server to respond with some data over the internet. Those are the types of things you'll use asynchronous code for. And so fetch is the function that, and I'm going to get to talking about that. I have some slides on it, but fetch allows you to fetch some data from an API, and it's asynchronous. So you have to know how to write asynchronous code to work fetch, to be able to interact with another computer, a server, over the internet in your code. And so unlike the last slide, this code runs, the first line runs. The first part of this second line runs. It says fetch some URL, but then anything after this dot then, anything in here, this console log right here, this happens after this last line. So this very bottom line, so this happens, and then it skips that one, this next, and then at some later point, it runs this one here. So it's not in the order that you might typically expect. And the reason is we're using this dot then here. And the dot then says, wait for this fetch to return, which it sends a request through the internet to another computer. And then only when that finishes does it run whatever is in this dot then callback here. So this is an arrow function passing into dot then, and then dot then will say, once this fetch completes, which might be, 10 milliseconds, or it might be 10 seconds. I think there's like a default amount of time that it'll wait before it times out. But and again, I say it waits for some external event. In the case of fetch, it's typically pretty fast. It's like usually less than a second. So it's, a lot of times you won't even be able to tell that it's loaded for a second, but usually you will. It's like maybe half a second typically, or less. Okay, so that's asynchronous code, and now this is asynchronous code using fetch. So this is kind of a basic example of fetch, where we're not actually receiving the data and we're not using a real URL. Here, this is fetch using an actual URL. So the first parameter you pass into fetch is, and fetch is like a default function that comes with JavaScript that allows you to send requests through the internet. So we're going to fetch from cats.com. Well, in our actual homework, we're going to be fetching from airtable.com. We're going to wait for a response from that server, and then get the response, which it's kind of a strange syntax, but this is just how it looks. You have a dot then, and then you have an arrow function. And then in the arrow function, we can pass in a variable. This can be called anything you want, but the tradition is you call it res for response. So dot then, we get the response. And then in this, in between these yellow curly braces right here, that's where we have the response from the server. So any code that we run in here has waited for the fetch to respond, or the server to respond with our cats. And this is a slightly simplified example. We'll get to the real actual examples. Just trying to demonstrate the point. But you'll see we'll be writing some actual, like fully fleshed out examples here. So there's two different types of running asynchronous code. One is using the dot then syntax, and one is using async and await. So these are both keywords in JavaScript. .then is, this will be a method on any function that returns a promise. And I'll leave it at that. I don't want to dive back into promises. A promise, basically what you need to know is it's what allows for asynchronous code. Like under the hood, promises are being created that allow for asynchronous code. And .then is a method that's returned, or a method on the return object from a promise. So I'm probably just confusing you more by saying that, but this is the syntax. Get used to it. It's a little bit confusing, but you have .then, and then you have the response from the server, and that response will have your data that you want from Airtable in this case, or cats.com actually in this case. Then there's this other syntax, and this syntax is newer. So the .then syntax has been in JavaScript for a long time, or I think there was a time without it, but not since I have been learning it. Async and await is the newer, better, probably simpler for most people way of doing asynchronous code. They do the same thing, but the async and await syntax is a little bit easier to understand for most people. So with async and await, these are also keywords in JavaScript. Any function that's going to be containing asynchronous code, like a fetch, you'll put the keyword async before the function. So async function get cats. And now this function, JavaScript knows now that this function has some asynchronous code inside of it. And that allows us to write await. So if we were to write await without marking this function as asynchronous, we get an error. You can't await in a function that isn't marked as asynchronous, because when you call that function, you need to await that function. So await, so async marks a function as being awaited. So any function that has async before it can be awaited. And then fetch returns a promise. And so instead of doing .then, we can await fetch and then store the result in a variable here. So in the same way as over here with the .then syntax, we're getting that response after waiting. Here we have to use a callback function, and here we write it almost like it's just normal code, like normal synchronous code. It looks more like what you're used to. You just have to say await before an asynchronous action. And then the variable would be returned into this normal variable. And then any code that we write after this will have waited for this fetch to occur. Okay, moving on to kind of more officially fetch. So JavaScript runs in the web browser on the client's computer. So your web browser is like Google Chrome or Safari or Edge or Firefox. These are all, it's an application that allows you to browse the internet. And what it's doing is connecting you to websites, and those websites are running as code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on your computer. And so there's this difference between code on your computer, which would be the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from your website, and then a server computer. The server is what sends you that website code. So anytime you type in like youtube.com or something, their server sends your computer a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then your computer runs that code using your web browser. Now, what if your computer wants to get more data from a different server, another server? Typing in a URL will implicitly send a response to a server. Like typing in a youtube.com and pressing enter, that's sending an HTTP request to a server. But in your code, you can hard code in, or you can like manually in your code call to servers. You can send requests to servers for data. And so that is what fetch is for. Fetch allows you to do that. So fetch allows for data transfer between a client and a server. So your app is running, your like website is running in your web browser, and you use fetch to fetch data from a server. And that server typically is connected to a database. This is kind of the full stack architecture for an app. It's like the most kind of simplified version, but you can generally assume most applications or websites are going to have a front end and a back end. The front end is going to have a web app or maybe a desktop app or an iOS app or whatever. And then there's typically going to be a server and a database. And the server stands between the database and your app because you don't want people having full access to your database as the app developer. It's a security risk. Okay, so fetch is an asynchronous function in JavaScript used for sending and receiving data over the internet. It sends requests and receives responses. Those are the important terms to know is requests and responses. So you send a request to a server, the server responds back with a response. And it uses HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. I don't know if, I'm not going to formally introduce it right here, but you will start learning HTTP as time goes on as a developer. That's why every URL has HTTP before it. You might see like this cat URL, HTTP://. That means we're using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's like a handshake. It's like a language between different computers for how to communicate over the internet. And that's what fetch uses. So you can decide if you're going to send data to the computer, you send it through a post request. And if you're going to get data, and I have this slide here, this is a GET request. So by default, fetch will send a special type of request called a GET request, which is defined by the HTTP protocol. So by default, if you type in a URL into the fetch call, and that's it, it'll send a GET request to that server. And then based on the type of request and the URL, it'll go to a specific server based on the URL. And that server will do something different depending on if it's a GET request or a different type of request. So a GET request is the typical request that you send when you want to get some information. It's pretty self-explanatory. A post request is kind of like, you could think of it as like the action, like making a post on the internet or something. A post request says, I want to send data. So GET request gets data from the server, and a post request sends data from your computer to the server computer. So you could say, I want to store some information in a database, and today we're going to be storing your to-dos in an Airtable. Actually, we're not going to be, I think the stretch goal is to do a post request. I think today we're just going to be doing a GET request, and then probably next week a post request, I assume. But for right now, we're just going to be manually adding your to-dos to the Airtable database, and we're going to do a GET request. But just so you know, the fetch, like the interface for using fetch can take 2 parameters. So for this basic GET request, it takes 1 parameter, and that's the URL of the server. A post request, you have to pass in this second parameter into fetch. And the second parameter is an object that defines the options. It's like a configuration, basically. And so it can end up looking kind of complicated, but just remember, this is just an object with a bunch of different things that we can specify, like the details of how this fetch works. So here we're defining the method. Instead of get, we're doing a post request. And then we can pass in some headers, which say we want to receive JSON data. And then the body, and I don't, sometimes I have to like go and relook this up. I don't have all this memorized every time I do a post request or a different, like when I'm doing options for fetch, I sometimes have to relook it up. So just know, like, it's not super important that you memorize the exact syntax here, but just know you can change the way fetch works using the second variable options. And one of the things you can send is a body. So the body of the request, you have like headers, and then you have the body. The headers say basically it's like metadata about what the request is going to be, or it's telling the server what the server is going to be receiving and what you want in response. And then the body is data that you're sending. So here we're sending my message. So we're sending a post request to the server that is an object called my message. And it has a property called title with the value sup. And then we're using JSON.stringify to turn your message into a JSON string, which JSON is the format that your data needs to be translated into in order to send it over through HTTP. So this is how you turn a JavaScript object into JSON format. And we did do this for adding your data to the local storage in your browser. So we have gone through that. But anyways, that's a post request. And then this is kind of the full implementation using .then. It can start to look kind of confusing, but I'll try to walk you through it here and you'll see the parts that matter. A lot of this will look the same every time, and you'll kind of get to feel like which parts of it you actually need to worry about and which parts are going to be copy and pasted every time you do a fetch. And there are certain parts of this that will remain the same every time. So when you first look at it, it's going to look confusing, but there's certain parts that are going to stay mostly the same every time you do a fetch. So here we're fetching from cats.com. And then since we're doing .then syntax, I'll show you async and await next. But with .then syntax, we say .then, we get the response. We check if the response has a property called OK. If it doesn't, if the response is not OK, which in fetch, a response will always have this OK property that's either true or false. And if it's false, then we want to throw an error that says no cats or whatever your error message is that you want. If we get past this if statement, that means that we haven't thrown an error and the response is okay. So we're going to return the JSON. Well, let me back up. We're going to return response.json. We're calling a method on the response called .json. And this method here converts your response from the server into actual usable JavaScript information, like a JavaScript object. We're converting it from JSON into regular JavaScript. And I know it looks kind of confusing because you'd think by calling JSON on something, it would turn it into JSON, but I don't know why, but you do the opposite. Res.json turns it from JSON into a JavaScript object. I could have this wrong. I think response is, I think it's what's called a data stream. So it's like a stream of data that, I don't know. There's some details about this I don't fully understand. So I guess that goes to show that there are certain parts of this that you really need to know there are certain parts that are going to be similar most every time you do it. So you're always going to call response.json to turn the response into JavaScript that you can use. Then you have another dot then. And that's where we have the data. So the data will be what we actually get returned from the server. And then we usually have to parse that data. We have to like go into the data. It'll usually be an object with lots of nested objects or arrays within objects. And usually you want to console log the data property to see what it looks like and then get out the properties you actually want. Because data typically is going to just be this unfiltered version of all of the data that you got from the server. It might not be the exact thing you're looking for. It might just contain that as a nested property. So typically your data that you get is going to be this complex object. And so we drill into that data using, and it's going to be, this part's going to be specific to the data we get back. So you want to console log it out to see what it looks like. And then here I'm saying data.body.cats. That is the part of this object that has our cats that we want. And then at that point we have cats and we can do whatever we want with them. At the end, we have a dot catch. And the dot catch, this will only run, the code in this callback will only run if an error gets thrown anywhere in between this dot then, or actually from the fetch all the way to here. If in any of these dot thens, if an error is thrown like this one, we'll end up in here. So the code, it's almost like an if statement. If no error, then we just continue as normal and we skip over the catch. If an error is thrown anywhere in here, which it could even just be like a syntax error. Like if you, wrote just like invalid JavaScript in here, it would actually end up in this catch block, which basically it causes your code to, instead of fully erroring out and stopping, it catches the error and allows your app to keep going even though you had an error. And it can be confusing, this syntax, I know that. So that's why we have async and await, because it hopefully makes it more intuitive. So this would be a full implementation of the same thing using async and await. So we have an async function called getCats. Whenever you're writing async code, we don't have a dot catch. So instead of having dot catch, what we have is a try catch. So you can see the first thing we have is try. And then anything in this here, if it throws an error, it'll end up in this catch block here. So catch will catch the error and then console log it out or do whatever you want with it. So it's a little bit more like an if statement here. You have try, which says if an error occurs in here, then send it directly to here. If no error occurs, then skip the catch. So that's, you have to do try catch when you're using async and await. So here we're saying response equals await fetch cats.com. This will wait until we get the data and we don't have to do any dot thens after the fetch. We just wait, we await the fetch, and then this response, any code under here, the response will have the response. If the response isn't okay, so same as the other one, if the response is not okay, we throw an error, which will send it into this catch block. If the response is okay, we skip that and we get the data. And again, there's this thing about JavaScript data streams where you have to turn it into an actual JavaScript object using another await or another dot then, depending. So here we're saying I want the data, and now we have our cats. Okay. I'll pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions on that? I know it got intense quickly with all this. It's a lot. it's confusing to look at this stuff if it's your first time. Okay, no questions.
Hi, Riva.
Hey,
And I have question.
yep.
Why we use second await?
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of, yeah, good question. I was a little bit avoiding the answer because I don't feel confident to fully explain it. Um, we get this response object from fetch, and the response object is not actual. We can't use this as actual normal, like it basically the response is I'm I'm pretty sure, which this is kind of like going a little bit outside of my full understanding, but the response is like almost like a header that we get back that says, here's your, it's kind of like the download is occurring. Like when you download something, and it shows like the file shows up in your downloads folder, but it's still like loading. It's still like currently downloading. That's how I think of response is we get the we get the validation that this fetch request it worked. Um, but there's still data coming in. And so response.json takes the initial response we get back and then has to wait for the full like body of that response to come in. And um, I wish I had a better explanation for that. Maybe I'll do a quick Google and see if I can find a better explanation. Why two fetches? Why two fetch in JavaScript? Okay, we got an answer with a -1. Probably don't want to listen to that person. And another one. Okay, let's see what else we got. I realized why it takes two.then promise calls to fetch the data. When we make a fetch call, it returns us with headers and other metadata information. This is brilliant, as in case if we only want to see the status code, we don't have to wait for the server to compile the whole body for us. And all we would do is check the status code. Now that the client knows the request is okay, we can make another call and fetch the response body. Okay, so I think that's about what I was kind of how I had interpreted it is your first fetch, you're basically just it's an initial touch point with the server. It's saying, hey, I just want to know that you're there and I want to tell you that I have this like request. And the server, before it responds with the full data, it sends back a verification that says, I got your request and I'm packaging up your data and sending it. And so what it allows you to do is if you wanted to test, oh, if you wanted to test if a server is working, but you don't want to wait for the entire response to come back, you just want to see if it could send back the data you want, then you could check if the data is okay and then not do a second request to the server that says, give me that data. Um, I hope that I hope that helps. It's the best way I can describe it. Your first request is an acknowledgement with the server, and the server sends back, yes, I have your data and I'm preparing it. And then the second one, when you do response.json, it says, I want to actually, I did the acknowledgement with the server. Now give me the data that is prepared for me. And it sends you all the data. So, yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, let's go on to high level view of an API. So API, you've seen this word a lot, I'm sure. It stands for Application Programming Interface, which that doesn't really give you any um, idea. Doesn't really describe it at all. It's kind of confusing. So we can compare it to a UI, a user interface. So anytime you're using an app or your phone or a TV or anything like that, everything that you're interacting with is a user interface. Um, it's the graphical representation of what's going on internally. So the user interface it defines the set of interactions that you can have. It's how the application and you communicate to each other as the user. So the user interface is how the user interacts with an application, which could include buttons and menus and uh, you know, all sorts of UI elements. So all things in HTML and CSS would be dealing with UI elements. So that's user interface. Application programming interface, API, instead of specifying how the user interacts with something, it's specifying how the programmer interacts with an application. And the programmers interact with applications through code. So how do you write code to interact with a specific application? So an API is the coding equivalent of a UI, where you can interact with an application through visual elements like buttons and stuff, but you can also have your code interact with an application. So here, our code, our app is going to interact with the Airtable API. So Airtable has defined a set of, um, you know, features that they make available to you. So the programmers at Airtable defined, you know, how you can interact with their servers. And the way that you interact with them is using the application programming interface. So how do you interact with another application or some bit of code? You'll also see API referred to like uh, in React. If you go to react.com and start reading their documentation, it's called the API docs. So every bit of code that's out there for you to use in your code, every library or framework or whatever, um, those have an API. It's basically a set of guidelines for how to use it. It's how to use some code or an app. And it's very broad, the term. So the Airtable API lets you interact with Airtable's servers within your application. AKA, it allows you to sync your React app with to-dos from an Airtable. So you can have your React app running. Your React app can interact with Airtable's app, and then you can send to-dos back and forth using Airtable's API. And the way that we do it is using fetch, and the specific kind of URL that we have to use. That is one way that we define, we tell Airtable, which table we want to use if we're sending or receiving. Well, we use HTTP headers for that. But yeah, the Airtable API tells us how to interact with their servers. And there's a graphic for it. Okay, so what is an API key? We have to use API keys today. Actually, we're using technically a personal access token, even though in the assignment they call it an API key. It's pretty much the same thing. Certain people have different words for this. I think they're slightly different, but I don't fully know the difference. Just think of it as an API key, even if it says personal access token, it means basically the same thing. An API key is basically a password for an app. So the Airtable servers, they don't want to make any any Airtable available to you within your app. Typically in an app, you have to create an account, you log in, and you have access, you have like privileged access to specific things. You can add things to your Airtable and delete things from your Airtable, but you don't want people who don't have your login to be able to add or delete things from your Airtable. And same thing goes for programming. If you are programming an app, and you are interacting with your Airtable, you don't want someone else to be able to interact with your Airtable with their app. And so you use an API key as basically a password. And you put it in your code so that when you send a request using fetch, you put your API key in that fetch call. And Airtable will validate that you have the permission to access that table. So it depends on which API you're using, but most APIs are going to have API keys. So you have to make an account with them and basically verify that like you have an account and you have access to the specific data you're trying to get in your application. So it's a password for an app, it protects your data, and it's a type of authentication. So authentication means you are registered with this app. It's the process of creating a user in an application. So if you're writing server code, there's a whole process that you go through for authentication where you basically check that someone passed in the right username and password and that they actually have an account with you. And so API key is basically a way of authenticating the user or the application, like a password. So this is how you send an API key in fetch. So you fetch some URL. And then again, we're seeing this options here in the fetch, which makes fetch look a lot more crazy, but all it is just this object with some different key values that define some options for how the fetch is going to work. And one of the things that you can pass in is in headers, you can pass in an authorization. And then in here, you'll typically have a string that says bearer, which means, well, I don't even know, honestly. I was going to try to describe what bearer is there for. I don't even know. But the important thing is you have your key, your API key here. So this was me mashing on my keyboard. This is not a real API key, but this is what it might look like. And for Airtable today, you're going to have something that looks like that. And then this fetch request will now be validated by the server that you send it to. It'll say, oh, cool, you have the key that we need if you're going to access this URL. But there's a problem here. We have our key hard-coded into our code. So this access key, this API key here, is just written in as normal code within our app. And that means anyone who can see our code is gonna see our API key. And you might think, who's gonna be looking at our code? Well, anyone who knows how to program and knows this stuff, they have the option to potentially steal data from you, mess up your servers and all that if they have access to your API key. And remember, this fetch call will be running on someone's personal computer because you have a website, your website sends its data to someone else's computer. So someone else's computer is running the fetch call that you write for your website. It's running on their computer. And that means they can go into their console on like Google Chrome or something, and they could actually see this hard-coded value. So, and you could also see it on GitHub. So basically, there's ways that people could see this, which is bad. You don't want that. You don't want people to be able to see your password. And so you have to hide it. And how do you hide a value that's just in your code? how do you hide part of your code? Because so far you could just keep all of your code hidden, but what if you want to put it on GitHub and you want other people to be able to work on it and you want to be able to send it to people's computers to run on their computers in their web browser? We can't just hard code that API key in. That's bad. And yeah, looks like Amanda and Natalie both got that. Yeah, we use environment variables. Exactly. So you got it, environment variables and secrets. That's how you hide some information within your code. So an environment variable is a variable that isn't in your code, but it's accessible by your code. So you don't you don't put directly into your program the values for your environment variables. You put those in a separate file that's not tracked by Git, and you don't share that file with anyone. So you have your secrets, your personal, like your API tokens and stuff, your API keys. You have all that stuff inside these environment variables, which basically it's a special type of process for putting variables into your code without actually hard coding them in. Your program actually has access to them because it's in the environment. And there's a bunch of every programming language is going to have ways of doing environment variables. And pretty much all of them are going to have a whole bunch of environment variables that are there by default, depending on the person's computer. So there are things you like in your code, you could access what type of, like what time is it? That could be something in an environment variable. Or what type of operating system is this code being ran on? You could access that information in an environment variable. So the reason it's called an environment variable is because it has information about the external environment that your code is running in. So your code has its like actual execution scope. And then outside of that, you have the environment, which is where it's being ran. And environment variables allow you to, your code to access things that are outside of your code. And one of the core things that it's used for is storing secrets. So a secret is basically just an environment variable that is supposed to be hidden in secret, because there's environment variables you might be fine with sharing with people. Like, is the environment for this code, you might have your code test, is this being ran in a test environment or a development environment or a production environment? Because you might run the same code in multiple different settings depending on your stage in development. You could say any code that gets to my actual like production server that's running this application, I want an environment variable that says this is running in production, and you might have it connect to a different production database or do something different. You might have all of your console logs not actually console log if it's in production. And so you can set those in environment variables, and then it'll change what your code does based on the execution environment. And secrets are just an environment variable that you're hiding from anyone. You don't want anyone to see, like an API key. And you store them in a file called .env. And then you can specify, like the .env, that's kind of a convention for the name for a file that you're storing environment variables. And then you can add, in this lesson, we're going to add .local. So it's going to be .env.local. And what that means is it's an environment variable, or it's a file for environment variables. And it's specific to your local environment, your computer. You might have a .env.test or a .env.dev or a .env.production or whatever. And you make sure that it's ignored by Git so that it doesn't end up in GitHub. Because if you store all of your secrets in this .env file and then it just gets put onto your GitHub for everyone to see, that defeats the whole purpose. And so we put them in a file that's specifically ignored by Git. So this is what it'll look like in your project. You'll have this .env.local, which is a file. And in there, we can store your secrets. And it'll look like this. My secret API key equals, and then the value of it. So it's stored just like a variable, except it's not JavaScript, it's not Python, it's not any language here. It's specific to environment variables. They're stored in this very simple syntax. And depending on the programming language you're using or the environment it's running in, you'll find there's ways to access these variables. And so it's specific to the language you're using, and it's also specific to, like in JavaScript, there's a way to access environment variables built in, but it's not super intuitive. There's kind of some additional steps that make it more complicated. But Vite, which is helping you make your React code, Vite has a special process for importing these environment variables. And so this is what the syntax looks like. You'd have your fetch, you have your authorization, bearer, and this is where the API key was previously hard-coded. But instead here, we have this string interpolation, and we're saying inside the curly braces here, we're saying access the environment variable, my secret API key. And the syntax, and again, this is specific to Vite, which Vite is helping you run your React code. The syntax looks like import.meta.env or env dot, and then the name of that environment variable. And now when your code runs, this will go and grab that value and keep it hidden, but it'll actually put it in there when your code runs. Okay. It's the end of the slides. Kind of a long one today. I know we're an hour in and I haven't gotten into coding yet, but I just felt like there was a lot of potentially new concepts to go over, and I wanted to make sure I gave everyone a good kind of framework to work from, because once we get into coding, it's going to look you're just going to be more confused if you don't understand what these types of things are. So yeah, I'm about to get into coding, but I want to check in and just make sure, yeah, just kind of temperature check. How's everyone feeling? Is this making sense? Anything you want clarified?
I think you clarified a whole lot of stuff with your lesson, and you made things a lot easier to understand. I was just curious though, when you put your code on GitHub, do you know if there's a way to make environment variables for GitHub so that it's not posted there so people can't see them, but you can use them in your React application that's going to be displayed in your Git pages or on
Yep.
your...
Yep. Good question. So every environment, every place that you're actually wanting your code to run, whether that's a server or GitHub or wherever, they're going to have an option for you to put environment variables in there. And so I could show you, let's go to a random project. I'll go to my portfolio project. And here, I'm sure I'm using environment variables in here somewhere, but I don't have a .env file. I do have a .env.local.example. So this is an example of these are the keys that if you want to if you want to download my portfolio and run it on your computer, you need to have the values for all these things. You need to input those values. So this is the example of the environment variables. The actual values of them in GitHub would be stored in settings, environments, I think. Oh, there's secrets and variables. Wait. Deploy keys. I think it's in environments, and I would go further, but I don't want to show all of my environment variables for my app. Actually, I don't even think I have any in here. I think I have my app. Yeah, I have my portfolio running on vercel.com. So Vercel is like a place to host React apps. Or actually, yeah, you can host React apps on here. You can also host Next.js apps. So they make Next.js, which is a React. It's like a framework on top of React, but they have here, somewhere in here, settings, environment variables. So
Okay.
anywhere where your code is being ran in like production, you can have environment variables. Every one of those production environments should have a section for you to store your environment variables.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question. Okay, how does everyone feel about getting into some coding?
That would be cool.
Okay. Cool. So, and everyone can still see my screen and hear me all right, right?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so we've been working on this cats app. And we have a cat list. You can add a cat, you can remove a cat. Yeah, cats list. So we're gonna keep building on this for this assignment today. And really quick, sometimes I like to work in multiple desktops. So I can jump back and forth between different things. So let's see. Let me bring up my VS Code, pull it over into here. Okay. Yeah, that should be good. Okay. So, and again, if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to stop me. But yeah, let's get to coding. So we have this app that just, it's storing cats. I think at the moment it's storing them in local. Is it storing them in local storage? Where is it?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay. Yep, local storage.set item. Okay. Cool. So, oh yeah, and then local storage.get item. So yeah, we're using local storage. We have this set timeout here, which is just there's no real use for it. We're just demonstrating using promises and asynchronous code. So set timeout is a way to make your JavaScript code wait for a certain amount of time. And so it's asynchronous. And so we have this complicated thing here that all is just simulating waiting for actual real asynchronous code. This is asynchronous because we're making it asynchronous for fun, and it's waiting 2 seconds before we get the cats. Now what we want to do is actually use a genuine asynchronous interaction, which is interacting with Airtable with our code. So that's kind of what we've been building up to. So we're going to use fetch today, and we're going to fetch our cats from an Airtable. So I'm just going to pull up the instructions here and we can walk through it. I'd say these might just confuse you for now if you look at them, but I think they could help. There's certain things about this that I think aren't, or maybe it is right. I remember when I was looking at these, there were certain things that I thought might not work, but I can't remember now. Okay. So starting out, you have to set up an Airtable account because everyone is going to be using their own Airtable to store their to-dos. And so I'm not going to walk you through that. I made an Airtable, and just for the sake of time, I have to just say, make an Airtable account, follow these instructions, and then at some point you should have, and I've never used Airtable, so I think, if I could get through it, I think you could, hopefully. Airtable, it's basically like Excel. It's like a spreadsheet, except a lot cooler and better. And it allows you to have these different bases, I guess, with different tables and cool stuff. And basically, we're just storing information in tables using this app called Airtable. And Airtable has an API, and you can get to that API. So you make an account, you make a base, which I don't even know. I think a base is like a project, and then a table is a table within that project. It's like a nested thing. You have tables within your base. So I made a base called my cool base. And then I made a table within that base and called it default. That's very important. Your table has to be called default because, yeah, rename table 1 to default. So you have to use default as your table name because at some point later, we have that hard coded into our fetch request is default. Or actually, I think we have it as an environment variable, maybe. I'll check later. But yeah, you should have an Airtable account, a base in it called whatever you want, a table in it called default, and then the table should have this schema. You should delete all other columns, and then it should have a title column with a couple values, and then a completed at column, which we're not going to be using at the moment. We're going to use later, like in another lesson. So now we have our cats, to-dos in your case, but cats in my case. And then you can actually get to the, I think, yeah, next you have to create an environment file. So remember a file to store your environment variables, and you're going to call it .env.local. So we're going to open VS Code, create a file named .env.local in your root directory, so in the base level of your project. .env files uses syntax variable equals value to add key value pairs. It's tradition to use all capitals. I don't know why, but for the key. So that's what you do. I think it's because it comes from like constants when you're declaring like, well, not all constants are going to be variables like this, or all caps, but if you have values in your code that are like hard coded in, like pi or something, like 3.14159, whatever, any variable that's all caps means this is a very specific hard coded value right here. So that's what your environment variables should look like. And so I'll just demo that here. So I'm going to go into my project. I'm going to create a .env.local file. And I already have one, but I'm just going to delete it and recreate it. Actually, I'm not going to delete it because I think I need my secret. Also, I'm going to be showing you all are going to be able to see my secret in our lesson today. I normally wouldn't do that, but there's no easy way I could see to get around it. So you're going to all see the API key that I have for my project. So don't hack into my database, please. And if you do, that's probably fine, but whatever. In the video, I'm going to like upload this to YouTube, and in the video, I'll like blur it out. But just so you know, no promises. Yeah, please don't hack into my database, but whatever if you do. It's not really, I don't think it's gonna like charge my credit card or anything, so whatever. Okay, so you're gonna make a .env file, and you're gonna call it .env.local, and I'm just gonna call this .local -1. I already have .env.local in here because I already made this and stored my API key in there. And so just imagine that I'm going to delete that. I don't need, I'm showing you how to make a .env.local. Just imagine I just made this. Here it is. So this has my environment variables, and it has one called Vite Airtable API token, one called Vite Airtable base ID, and one called Vite table name. And you can see all of these are in the instructions here. You have create your .env.local, and then you generate an API token. Oh, generate an API token, and then save it as this, and then so I'll walk through this step by step. So generate an API token. That means go to Airtable. In your Airtable account, go and at this moment you shouldn't expect to have these values yet. You shouldn't have anything in your environment variable file, or I mean, you might, depending on where you are in the assignment, but if you're at this moment in the assignment following along, you do not need any values for those variables yet. We're about to get those values for the environment variables. So we're going to go to your Airtable account and then create a new token, a new API key. If you have any tokens already for the base, we recommend deleting your old ones first. Make sure the scopes option includes data records read, data records write. So yeah, basically what that looks like is you go to, I think, help, API documentation down here. And then it basically has some documentation for you. And it's telling you this should be the title of your current, Airtable API for my cool base. So this is a specific set of instructions for using your specific base, which means the ID of it and the API key and stuff are going to be in here. So here, the ID of my base is that, and I think you need that. Let's see. What's the first thing we need? Or actually, create a new token. Oh, I use this link to generate my token. I said, please visit here. Click that. I think, I don't remember. I'm not going to generate a new token right now, but maybe I should show you how to do it. Okay, account overview, go to developer hub, API key. API keys are deprecated. Create personal access token. Okay, so I think what that looks like is this, that account. So your profile picture, account, overview, API keys. It says it's going to be deprecated, which means they're not doing API keys anymore. They're actually doing personal access tokens. So you'll click on that, and then I'll say create token. So we're actually not doing technically an API key, we're doing a token. And this is my personal access token, aka my API key. And yeah, you create one, and then you have to copy the value and title it whatever you want. And then this will give you access to your specific database in Airtable. Okay, I hope that was a little disjointed because I can't remember exactly the steps I went through. And anyways, you'll figure it out. Create an API token. And then once you save it, it will give you a token for you to copy. It'll only show your API token once. If you lose it, you need to regenerate a new token. So once you've generated your API token, you need to copy it and then paste it into .env.local. So you create a new variable called this, Vite Airtable API token. So I created Vite Airtable API token, and then I pasted the value of my token right here. So now my token, I can access this value within my JavaScript or my React code. And it's not included in Git. So it won't be available for anyone to see ever, except for all of you right now. But the reason this isn't included in Git is because you have a .git ignore file. And in your .git ignore file, it specifies all the files that aren't going to be included in Git. And one of them should be, anything.local. And yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. So if there's anything that ends in .local, it won't be included in Git. And this file is .env.local. So this will not be included in Git. And then you have to get your base ID, which I think I showed you how to do that. And then you call the name of your table default, the table name default. Okay, so once you get those values, you need to write some code. We get to write some code. Or wait, yeah, back in our table, API documentation, blah, 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 blah. Get these values. That's the point of that. Once you have those, we need to fetch data from Airtable. So finally, some coding. So we're going to open our app.jsx file. And then above the first use effect, we're going to create a new async function, fetch data. And yeah, let me zoom in a little bit so I can, just to make sure everyone can see. Okay, so we're opening app.jsx and we're above the first use effect, creating a function, an async function called fetch data. So I'll just start with that. So app.jsx above this use effect right here, above that, I'm going to create a new async function. So I'm going to say async function called fetch data. And I'm just going to make that an empty function for right now. So new asynchronous function called fetch data. It's asynchronous because we're going to be using some asynchronous code in here. And if you can guess, we're going to be using fetch in there, which is asynchronous. So this whole function needs to be asynchronous so that when we call the function, we can wait for the function to return. And the function will, inside the function, we're going to be waiting for fetch to return. Okay, so we have this kind of outline for this new function, fetch data. Let's go see what else we need. Replace the contents of the use effect with a call to fetch data. Okay, so inside this use effect here, I'm going to delete everything so that it's just this callback function and then the empty dependency array. And if you remember, the empty dependency array is a syntax for use effect that says, if there's an empty array right here, only run this code when your app first loads this component. And since this is kind of your base component, this use effect will only run once by default. Empty array, only run this once when your app first loads. So anything we write in here will only load once, even though in React you have components re-rendering over and over. It'll skip running this, any coding here, it'll skip running over and over again as your component re-renders. It'll only run this once. And that's kind of one of the core values of using a use effect here. Is we only want to fetch the data once. So replace the contents of the use effect with a call to fetch data. Okay, so in this use effect, we want to call our new asynchronous function, which for now doesn't do anything, but we're going to call fetch data. And my guess is we're going to await that function. Remember, because async and await always go together, and we're going to get an error because this is what happens when you use await in a function that isn't asynchronous. Cannot use keyword await outside an async function. So what is the async or what is the function that we're using await in that isn't asynchronous? It's this callback here, this arrow function. This arrow function is not asynchronous, and so we can't call await. It won't do anything. So I think they might tell us how to fix that, but I might just do it. A call to fetch data inside the fetch data function, declare. Okay. So they kind of just go right into, oh, you know what? I'm remembering, we actually don't need to await fetch data here. We just want to call it like that. And the reason is because we're not going to return, if we wanted to like return something like const data equals await fetch data, that's a time that you have to use await on an asynchronous function. But fetch data this function here is actually going to be the one in charge of changing our React state. We're going to do it in this function. And so we actually don't need to wait for the response here. So I hope that makes sense. We don't need to wait for fetch data to finish because fetch data itself is going to be the one responsible for altering our state. If we wanted to return something from fetch data, then we would need to await it here. But we're not returning anything from fetch data. It's going to manipulate the state itself. Okay, replace the contents with fetch data. So we did that. Inside the fetch data function, declare an empty object variable. Okay, so we need an empty object named options. So const options equals an empty object. Add a method key with the value get. So a key called method, and the value is a string that says get in all caps, because this is going to be options to pass into your fetch request. Method get. So this object we're making here, this is what you saw in my calls, my fetch calls here, where we had fetch some URL, and then we pass in this object here with method, post, and other stuff. This object is what we're creating here. We can create it in the actual fetch call itself, or we can create it separately in a variable and then pass it into fetch. So here we're creating the options for our fetch separately from the actual calling of it. Okay. A method called get, so it's going to be a get request, and then add headers. A headers key with an object, authorization, bearer, import, meta, env. Okay, so this is saying a key called headers. The value is going to be an object with another key with that inside. So it's going to look like this. Headers, and then I'm going to paste. And I think I messed that up. Oh, I think I remember. They forgot when they gave you this, they forgot to put the starting backtick on it. So it ends in a backtick right here. And it should start with it too. So this could trip you up. Put a backtick right there, and then there should be a backtick at the end. And then in the end, it should look like this. Headers with an object. The object inside has a key called authorization. And then the value of authorization is going to say bearer, which is saying what is the, again, I don't know what bearer means, so I'm just not even going to try. But this is an interpolated string that says go get the environment variable called Vite Airtable API token. So this, in the end, is going to send a GET request. Oh, it's going to send a GET request, and this string is going to be populated with the value of your environment variable, your secret. And I think I messed something up in there. I think I forgot. Yeah. I need one more curly bracket at the end, or curly brace, and then this curly brace right here should not be there. So just so you know, I think they messed the syntax up on that a little bit if you copy and paste it. I think they have an extra curly brace right there. So you don't need that. Or you do, but you actually need to put that curly brace outside of that backtick, and then you need to start the whole thing with a backtick too. If you want, I'll just copy this and paste it into the chat so you can have it. Oh, and it looks like someone already got the correct version, so good job with that. Yep, that's what it should look like in the chat if you want to copy and paste it. Okay, so this complicated thing, but it's basically just creating an object that has the options for our GET request for our fetch, and it has the method is GET, a GET request, and then the headers variable, or the headers key has an authorization key, which has a string with our API token from our environment variable. Okay. Confusing first step, but we're doing it. Okay, create a new variable called URL and set it to this. Okay, more copying and pasting, which is nice. Const URL equals that, and it should actually be a string with backticks. And again, it's important that you use backticks here because we're using string interpolation. And in JavaScript, if you use double quotes for your strings or single quotes like that, there's no string interpolation going on anymore. Like this, where it replaces part of the string with the value from a variable. We can't do that the same way with single quotes or double quotes. We have to do it with backticks. So change it to backticks. Backticks. And then this has your, they did this for you, but what they're doing is they're creating this URL that accesses Airtable's API, which you could find this on their documentation, but you don't have to. This is how you access an Airtable, this URL, and then you need to pass in into the URL, you need to pass in the value of your database ID and the table name, which these are both coming from your environment variables. So in the end, this URL here will be a string that has all this stuff actually populated from your environment variables. And that's the syntax that Airtable has for doing that. On Visual Studio Code, would you mind going to the View menu? Tops. Oh. Word Wrap. I'm making an app called Word Wrap. It's like or it's just a random coding project I'm doing on the side. Okay, we're doing it. We have our options, we have our URL, and now these are the values that we're going to pass in for our fetch. So I assume the next step is doing a fetch call. So, set up a try catch statement for or after options. So we're going to do a try catch. I'll show you what that looks like. So remember, we're using async and await for our asynchronous JavaScript. And when you use async and await, you use try and catch. So you do try and then catch. And then catch will have a room for an error to come through. You can call it error. You might also see ERR, or you might even see E. I like to be verbose. It's not that hard to write out error. And this is our ESLint, our linter complaining. It's not an actual error in the code. It's just a code formatter recommendation. It's saying you shouldn't have a try catch block that's empty, but we're going to fix that. And I also like to do that. I think that's how Prettier would format it anyways. You have the catch like that. Okay, so now in our try, if you remember, any code that executes in our try, if it errors out, then it'll end up in our catch. So this is a way of error handling. And it's important to do error handling when you're interacting with other servers, like APIs over the internet, because you don't know, like you're in control of pretty much most of your environment on your computer, or you like the code in your computer. But when you're interacting with other computers in code that you didn't write, you don't know if the internet connection's bad, you don't know if their servers are down. And so in order to account for the fact that we can't control what's going on with the Airtable servers, we want to do error handling in our code. And so that's what these try catch things are for. We're saying if we send this request out and something is wrong with either our request or their server, then we can like gracefully handle that case. So in here, we're going to do our fetch. I know that. And we're going to pass in our URL and options like that, I think. Let's see. Add const response that awaits for fetch. Yep. And pass in URL and options as arguments for the fetch. So we're going to say const response equals await fetch. And then our fetch is getting our URL and options. And again, you've seen a slightly different syntax of this, like in my slides and stuff, where the URL was actually hard-coded in here and the options were hard-coded in there. You can also store them as separate variables. Does the same thing. So we're storing URL and options in separate variables, and then we're calling our fetch and passing the URL and options in. And now we're waiting for the fetch. So when the fetch returns, response should have the data from Airtable, as long as you got all of the URL and options correct, which that's probably the biggest room for error in this assignment here. So if you're getting, if you're having problems, having errors, it's likely because your options or your URL, there's like something wrong with it. And it could be something very subtle. Like I'm pretty sure in my headers thing here, the value that I copy and pasted, they had this extra curly brace here, like that. And I spent like 20 minutes debugging yesterday when I originally wrote it because they had that on accident. So it's, as with most code, every character matters in your syntax. If you have one thing wrong, then it can make everything not work. And so double, triple check that all these things are working. And if you really, if you're really stuck, if you're having trouble, what you should do, and what I did yesterday, is I checked to make sure that the values of these environment variables were coming through. I said const API token, or API key, whatever. API key equals, and then I pasted that. And now if I console log API key, we should see the value of that API key. So I'm going to go to my console, reload, and yep, there's the value of my API key. So this is getting loaded in from my environment variables. So that's something that is nice to double check, because your API key is there, and then you could duplicate that and go, let's make sure our base ID is there. So I could say base ID, and then use that environment variable, Airtable base ID. Okay. So we're getting our API key and our base ID. We're getting some errors, which are caused by something. We're not going to worry about it right now. It'll get fixed. So that's a way you can store your environment variables as variables and then console log them out, or you can just put it you can put this directly in the console log like that. But if you're having trouble, double, triple check that your options are correct, your URL is correct, and that these environment variables are coming in correct. If one of them isn't, then go into your, either change the name of this or go into your environment file and make sure that these names are correct and everything. So anyways, I'm just saying there's a lot of room for error. There's a lot of things that like your syntax highlighter won't catch if they're wrong. Like, you know, if we had async function like that, our code editor is going to complain. It's going to say that something's wrong. For things like strings with URLs and stuff like that, you're not going to get any hints from your code editor if you get it wrong. And so there's just a lot of room for error here. So yeah, just double, triple check everything as you're going. Okay, moving on. So we're doing response equals await fetch. So we should be getting a response from our error table. But if you remember, our response isn't actually where we're not done once we have the response. If you remember, someone, I forgot who, was asking about multiple dot thens. Why do we have to do dot then twice? Same thing with await. We have to do await twice. And the reason is because the response is not actually the data we want. It's just an acknowledgement from the server that says, yes, I have the data. Do you want the data? If you do, you have to do another await or another dot then. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to say const, well, I actually have to check if the response is okay first. It's not worth getting the data until we check if the response is okay. So if not, response dot okay, throw new error, and you create an error, which you can create an error if you haven't seen this before. This is how any error in JavaScript is created, even if it's just done behind the scenes. Well, actually, there's other types of errors, I think. But anyways, we're making an error. We're making our own error. And then the value we pass into this error is going to be our error message. So I'm going to say no cats. You can say whatever you want. Let's do a cat. A crying cat. So if we get a response from the server on our first fetch and the response is not okay, then we're going to throw an error that says no cats. And now in this catch block is actually it's going to jump straight here. So in our catch block, we're going to have this error value. The error is going to be the error that was thrown here. So the value of this error here is going to become this error here. So I could just say console.log error. There's other things you can do with an error, other ways of handling it. Like you could display it to the user. We could do like a, you know, we could display some JSX depending on if there's an error if you want, but right now we're not going to do that. We're just going to console log it out. And then, okay, so we checked if the response is okay. And I might jump back here just to make sure I'm doing it like in line with what they say. So in the try block, add const response that awaits fetch, passing the URL and options as arguments for the fetch. So we did that. Add a conditional statement that throws a new error if response.okay is false. Okay, so we did that. We made this if statement. If the response is not okay, we throw an error. Provide an error or the error and argument of, oh, okay. So I put no cats. They actually want you to put this interpolated string here that says response.status. So I'm going to pass that in instead. I'm going to do that with the backticks. Remember the backticks. So new error, and then this is going to be a string with the response status, which the response has an OK variable that comes back from the server, right? This response. It also has a status, and the status is going to be, I think, a number. Yeah, a number. If you want to know really quick about if we were to go to like github.com/ and then just a random string, we'll get this thing that says 404. A lot of web pages have like a default page they'll display if you send a request to the server that's an invalid URL, the response is going to be 404. And 404 is a specific status code that means page not found. So every HTTP response we get is going to have a specific status. And the status of that is going to be a number that tells you some information about it. And they just have this convention where a 404 means the page doesn't exist. A 200 means everything's great, everything's fine. And there's all these different status codes, and you have to just actually like see them to know them. They're just numbers, but they have representation. They have like a meaning in programming world. So I'll do HTTP cats and show you this. I'll just drop a link for this, but if you want this website, it is an API actually, but it's also just a website that allows you to see all the different status codes that exist and cat pictures associated with all of them. I'll put this in the chat. This is a great way of learning the HTTP status codes. So you can see 404 means not found. You can click on it and it tells you about that error code. 200 would be everything's okay. Yep. 200. Okay. So anyways, HTTP requests have status codes, and that's why sometimes you'll see on a website, like I could probably do any old website. If I went to Pinterest and Pinterest.com/ and then just a random thing. Oh, they don't show me an error code. Interesting. They even say show error equals true. But if I were to look in the network tab, in the console, the server responded with a status code of 404. So yeah, anytime you type in a URL that doesn't, it does hit an actual web server, which that's the important part. It hits the actual web server, but then after that, the route is undefined, then the server should respond to the 404. Probably a more in-depth explanation than you needed, but hey, it's good to know. Response.status, that's what status is. It's going to be a number that displays or that has either 404 or 200 or some other indicator of the status. Okay, throwing an error here will prevent the continued execution of the try block and moves the execution directly into the catch block if there's something wrong with the fetch's response. Okay, below, so if we didn't error out, if we didn't throw an error, then we want to get the actual data we want. So declare a variable called data that awaits a parsed version of the response using response.json. So if you remember right, the answer that, or the question that I had a hard time answering, but I looked it up, is you have to do another await. You have to do const. So response is not going to actually just, it doesn't itself have the data we want. The data is going to be gotten from saying response dot JSON, and you call it like that, like a function or a method. So data equals response.json, and we actually have to await it because it's also asynchronous. Await. Okay, now data, this here is actually going to be what we want. This is going to be the cats. So I could do console.log cat or data. And data is going to be a bunch of stuff. There's going to be a lot more than the cats because the server we sent this response to, Airtable, they're going to send a bunch more data than we actually need because they want to make sure that we can get the data we need. So the data we actually want is going to be part of this big nested series of things. So let's see. Oh, I know why this is happening, because in my local storage, it's probably, yeah, I had this error in the past too. So the way I fix that is by doing that. I could explain that, but I feel like I keep on going on tangents today and I want to wrap up at some point. Or wait, maybe that's not why. Is it somewhere else that I have to do that? I think it is. Cat list string equals JSON dot stringify cat list equals version set item. Okay, where is this coming from? Object is not valid JSON coming from storage. So this is telling me it's local storage. JSON.stringify cat list. Let me see what the cat list is. Console.log cat list. Cat list. No, that is not running. Or let's see about that. Okay, yeah, cat list is an empty array. And then we're trying to stringify an empty array, I guess. And that doesn't work. So how would I stringify? You know what? I'm just not going to worry about that because it's all going to be fixed soon anyways. Okay, moving on. So we have this data now, this data we want. But we need to parse it. I'll show you what it looks like. Let me get rid of this console log for the, I think I did. Okay. So we're getting this stuff back, the data. So this is the data object that we get back from the server after doing the response.json thing. It is an object with a property called records. And records has all of our cats or our to-dos or whatever. But it's going to have some like kind of nested properties and data. And like I've said, what you get back from an API is typically a kind of mess of just different nested objects and arrays. That is pretty typical. So you have to get used to looking at what they're going to look like. And it looks different depending on, like I'm in Chrome looking through their dev tools at this object. It might look different depending on where you look at it. But one thing you can do to like really make sure that you see exactly what it looks like. Well, never mind. I'm going to go on a tangent if I do. Okay, what this looks like is it's an object with a records property. Records is an array with our to-dos, or my cats in this case. Each to-do has a created time, an ID, and then this fields property. Fields has an object with title, and our title is Meowly Cyrus. So our cats are kind of, each one of our cats is an object with these different properties. What we really want is the title and the ID. The ID is just at the base level of each cat object. The title is within this fields property. So we need to get the ID and then fields.title to get our title. That's what it's going to look like. So I'll really quick just show you how to actually parse out the information we want. I'm going to say const cats equals, and let's imagine we're just trying to get the first cat. We would do data dot records, right? And I could even screenshot this. Let's see it. Okay, screenshotted. So now, oh, okay. So this is what our cat object looks like. So it's, oh, data dot, and then we need records dot. And after records, records is an array. And so this is the first element in it, and then the second element in it. Let's, for now, imagine we're just trying to get the first cat, because we're going to solve that later. We're going to actually map through records and get each cat. But for now, let's just imagine we're trying to get the first cat. Records dot, and then at this point, we're going to have access to, actually, we need records and then the first index of records, because records is an array. So that will give us, so index 0 will give us the first record, which is the first cat. Then we could do dot. Now we have the cat object, and we need to get the ID. So I'm going to do ID. And what if we want to get fields and title? Well, we're just going to store that in a separate variable for right now. So I could say cat's ID, and this should have the ID of the first cat. Let's do cat ID equals data.records.id. And here, instead of console logging data, I'm going to console log cat ID and just make sure that we're getting a cat ID. And in fact, I'll do that. This is how I like to format my console log, is if I'm console logging a variable, is I say a string of what the variable name is going to be, and then the actual variable, so that it console logs out. I know which, it's like tagging the variable in my console. So if I could get rid of that screenshot. Reload my page. Okay, so cat ID, and this looks like a cat ID to me. A random string, which is a cat ID. And I could even probably check in Airtable if I wanted. Meowly Cyrus, does it have metadata, an ID? Looks like we can't see it in just that view, but we're going to assume that that is the correct ID for Meowly Cyrus. We're getting an ID. Okay, now we want the title. And if you remember, it was data.records and then the first cat. And instead of .id, we're going to do .fields .title. And that will be cat title. So cat ID and then cat title. This is just drilling into that data object and getting the specific cat properties we want. Okay, there we can see it. We have our cat title of Meowly Cyrus and our cat ID of that random number, the ID that is assigned just to uniquely identify it in the database in Airtable. Okay, so that's how we get the cat ID and the cat title for the first cat. Now, what if we wanted to get it for the second cat? Well, we could copy and paste this and then change the indexes to 1, and that would get those same properties for the second cat. But we want to be able to have an arbitrary number of cats, so we want to use a loop, right? But there's an easier way than using a for loop. There's an easier way to do all this stuff, or it's definitely not necessarily easier to write when you first see it, but that's the way we're going to do it. We're going to use map. We're going to use something called a map. So we're going to say data.records, and you've probably seen JavaScript maps before, .map. So a map allows you to loop through an array and then return specific properties from that array, or from each object of the array. So it creates a new array. Yeah, let's see. A function that accepts 3 arguments. We only ever use 1, usually. It calls the callback function 1 time for each element in the array, and it returns an array that contains the results. So it's going to return an array of each thing that was returned as we mapped through each object. So we're going to map through each record. And I could even just say, I could call this cat. We're going to map through each cat. And you could call this to do in yours. We're going to map through each cat. For each cat, and I'm actually going to make this arrow function multiple lines. And in order to do, so I'm not going to do an implicit return in the callback. I'm going to do a multiple line return, which needs square brackets or curly brackets. If you just want to return in one line with an arrow function, you can leave it like that. But if you want to do a multi-line arrow function, you need to return it explicitly. So I'm going to say return, and we're going to return an object, and it's going to have specific objects from that cat. So remember records, and then records has each cat. Each cat had at the base level, it had an ID. So I could say ID is cat dot ID. And the title was in a property called fields. So I'm going to say title is cat dot fields dot title. And that's the syntax for getting an array that looks like this, an array of cats that has only the ID and title of each cat. We're basically mapping through each cat in this records array, and we're drilling into each of those records and forming a new object for each record with the cat ID and the cat title. And each time it returns, it adds to this, and this is no longer cat ID. This is just cats. This is our cats array that we're getting from Airtable. I hope that all makes sense, but this is just parsing the data we get back into a form that looks like the cat data that we've actually been using so far, or the to-do data. And I'm going to console log that out to make sure it all works right. So I'm going to console log cats. Maybe I'll do that. Reload. And we're getting our cats. And it looks like an array of 2 cats. Each cat has an ID and a title. We have Meowly Cyrus and Neil Catricaris. Cool. Okay, so we're getting these cats, and now the last step is we want to set cat list to cats. Set cat list to cats. I think. Oh, we need to set loading to false too. Set is loading to false. And there they are. So although it looks the same as when we started, these cats are actually coming from Airtable. And I can't add new cats yet. If I add cats, it adds them to local storage at the moment. Let's see, add cat, set cat list. Oh, okay. So this use effect, anytime the cat list changes, it tries to set the cat list to, okay. Okay, so we can't add new cats to Airtable yet, because for that we would need to do another thing that looks a lot just basically just like this. We're gonna do another thing in the future. That's a stretch goal. I don't think I'm gonna do it yet, but that would be posting cats. That would be a post request. It would look mostly the same as this, but it would be adding cats. And I don't know. I didn't try it yet. I guess I could maybe run through it, but let me make sure we're finished with this. Declare another variable to-dos, which accepts the result of mapping data.records. So this was the map that we just did. That was kind of confusing, but we mapped through the data and created a new variable called to-dos, or in my case, cats, which mapped over the records. Yep. See the code example above if you get stuck. Okay, it looks like they do have a map example in here, maybe. Yeah, right here. So this is their version of that. Same thing. And I think that's, oh, I guess console log error.message return null. I should probably add that too. So in our catch, I have console log error. It should be console log error.message. And then we can return null if you want. Doesn't matter, it's the end of the function anyways, so it won't do anything. You could even just return nothing like that. That'll do the same thing. But they probably have that there for a reason, so. And that's about it. I'm still, maybe I'll try to really quick figure out what's causing that error. I think it has to do with my cat list starting as an empty object, and then I'm trying to stringify an empty, which maybe I'll really quick just try stringifying an empty object. I'll show you something fun. If we open up a new browser tab anywhere, oh, maybe I'll open up an incognito window. New browser tab. In your console here, you can actually write some JavaScript. And so I'm going to test if you can JSON.stringify an empty array and get if you get that error. So I'm going to say JSON. And remember, this has nothing to do with my app that I'm writing. This is a completely different JavaScript environment. I'm just testing out something here. I want to see if you JSON.stringify an empty array. Okay. It doesn't give you an error. So that means this is not the problem. Let me see everywhere in my code that I have local storage. Anything that I have JSON.stringify. JSON. I don't think it could be this, but I'll try. I'm going to comment that out, see if we still get an error. Okay, no error. Data equals await response.json. It's that. That's what's causing the error. Must be. No? Oh. I'm not getting any errors anymore. I don't know what was going wrong. Okay, fun debugging session at the end, which I didn't learn anything from. It just fixed itself, but that's all. I feel like that was a very anticlimactic end. We did it. We're fetching cats from Airtable, and it's super awesome and exciting. And look at these cats coming straight from Airtable. And to verify that it works, let's go to Airtable and I'll add a cat. Maybe I'll see if Gemini can help me. Give me some cat celebrity pun names. These are pretty bad. Caddy Perry. Caddy Perry. Let's do Caddy or Cindy Clawford. Drew. Oh, we got to do Drew Harrymore. Okay. So I'm going to add Drew Harrymore. To add, press Shift Enter. Okay. Shift Enter. Oh, Shift Enter. Okay. Cool. So, and I'm going to delete that. Okay. So I added a new cat to my Airtable. Let's see if it shows up in my app. It did. There it is.
Awesome.
So yeah, so we have an app that is talking to Airtable, and now we can put things in our Airtable and it'll automatically update in our app, which is awesome. So yay, we did it. You're now writing asynchronous code, fetching from an API in React. It's a full stack application now, officially, because there's a database connected to it, or a backend. So yeah. How's everyone feeling? Any questions, concerns?
You know, it's really cool that you showed us that because although I had finished the assignment before the lecture today, for some reason I did not realize that those values were coming from the Airtable. I thought that they were on my local storage and that all I could do was console log the values thus far. And I was like trying to figure out how to get them to appear on the page. And now I'm realizing they are appearing on the page from Airtable.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's good. So it was actually doing it. It was working all along. That's good. Yeah, it's exciting. We're actually doing that. We're fetching data from, and I'm curious, I didn't really read this stretch assignment or stretch goal, add a post feature. So they don't really say any details on how to do it really, but I would do the stretch goal, but this is running really long today. Hopefully we're going to add, I mean, I would assume we're going to add a post. Okay. Extra last minute stretch goal time. We're doing the post request for fun. Okay. So we have our fetch data function, and now we want to do another version of it that's add to-dos or whatever. So I'm going to basically just copy that whole function and paste it. So now I have two of the exact same function, fetch data. This one I'm going to call add cats, add cat, and we're going to pass in a cat title. The options, we're going to have it be a post request. I think the headers should be the same. We might have to add an application.json, like a content type thing, but I'll see when I get there. We will need a body property that says JSON.stringify, and then we're going to want to pass in an object that has a title of cat title. So this is our cat. Well, actually, I'll say const new cat equals an object with a title of cat title. So we're passing in the cat title, then we're creating a new cat. This new cat object isn't going to have an ID because the IDs are now going to be generated automatically by Airtable. So Airtable internally creates an ID when you store a new object. And so we're not going to pass Airtable an object with an ID that we create. We're going to get the ID from Airtable. We're just going to pass it an object with the title. So we're going to get this new cat, body json.stringify, and instead of doing that, I'm going to do new cat, json.stringify new cat. That's the options for a post request. The URL, I assume, will look the same. So the main difference is that we're doing a post request and we're sending a body, and the body of our request is going to have the data that we want to send over, which is our new cat. And we're turning it into a JSON string so it can be sent through the internet. Try response equals await fetch. You still use fetch for sending sending data, even though fetch, like you think of the verb fetch. Actually, I guess the verb fetch kind of makes you think of throwing something. So anyways, yeah, fetch is used for sending and receiving information. So here we're sending a fetch request that says, I want to send you this new cat, and the new cat is in the body of this options object. If response.ok, we're still going to get a response. The response should be from Airtable, and it should say whether we successfully added a cat, which would be if response.ok. The data, I'm not exactly sure what the data thing is going to look like. I think we're still going to need that, but this part is going to change, I think. I'm just going to say at that point, I'm just going to console.log data, and then we can go from there. When are we going to call this add cat thing? We're going to call it when we're going to call it in this use effect that's remaining that has the cat list and is loading state. This use effect was waiting for our cat list to change, and anytime our cat list changed, it would run this code, which would set it would save the cat in local storage. Now we want it to send a cat to Airtable. Actually, you know what? I don't know if I think what we're going to want to do is just call that direct. I'm going to delete this use effect here. And I'm just going to have add cat, which sets our local variable, the cat list, with the new cat. I'm going to have add cat instead do, oh, we already have a function called add cat. Okay. Add cat to, we had fetch data. I'm going to say post data, and then this will be get data. So get data and post data. Post data is going to post the cat because we have two functions that were going to be the same name. So add cat, this is called when we, in our add cat form, we have on add cat and we pass in add cat. So our cat form is in charge of calling our add cat function here. Our add cat function is going to be in charge of calling post data and passing in the new cat information. What is new cat information? Let's go here and see. Handle add cat. On add cat, we're passing in new cat. New cat has the ID of date.now. We want to delete that. Okay, so we're already adding a new cat that has this same form. So I'm going to go back to app. And cat title is no longer, like, I just verified that cat title is going to actually look like this, which I was creating that again here. So cat title is actually going to be formatted correctly already. So I can delete that. And I can just replace new cat with new cat here. I think it was already called new cat. They used, oh wait. Yeah. Calling that new cat like that. And okay, so we add cat, post data, new cat, and then that'll call this, which sends the request to post a cat. Data equals await response.json. And so this won't update our cats locally, but I'm going to check in our console log if we can see, and I can check on Airtable to see if we can add new cats in Airtable. And it won't be updating our cat list when we add it locally yet, but I'm just going to check if it adds it in Airtable. I'm going to say new cat, add cat. I'm going to go to Airtable, reload. No new cats in here. So let's see, I could have had this open all along. Okay, 422. The server responded with 422. I actually don't know. HTTP 422, what does that mean? Unprocessable. Okay, so I do need to make sure that data in the request contains all valid fields. Okay, so I probably need to reformat this. I probably need a header that has content type application.json. So in here, in headers, where our authorization is, I'm also going to put content type application.json. Need a comma there. I'm guessing that's not going to fix it. I'm guessing what I need is, I kind of forgot, like I said, I sometimes look up how to do that. I think you need it to look like that. You need to pass in an object that has data of new cat. Let's see. Because that's what they have here. I assume might be right. Let's try it. Okay, so I need to try adding a new cat and see what happens. And I could even open my network tab. Your network tab is going to give you information like relevant to this. And maybe I'll put my console. Well, I'll keep it where it's at. Okay, new cat. New cat. And maybe I'll clear the console. Add cat. So let's see what happens. So we got the same status code, something's wrong. Okay, invalid request, parameter validation field, check your request data. Okay, I'm gonna go back in. Maybe let's undo this part. So we're just gonna pass in new cat.
Maybe the documentation for Airtable's API has a different format that it wants you to use for post data.
That's a good point. Yeah, if this doesn't work, then I'm definitely checking that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You're definitely right there. You should be doing. Oh, okay. Okay, Nihal commented with potentially the solution here. Let's see. I like the look of that. Let's try it.
Oh yeah, because it mimics more how the server sends you data.
Yep. Exactly. Let's try it. Okay. Network tab. New cat. Ah, damn. Okay. Field title cannot accept. Oh, invalid value for. Okay, so it's a different error, and I think it's actually better. This is more close to what we actually want. Field, so it's recognizing we're trying to put in that table, and the field title cannot accept the provided value. So I wonder what the title ended up being. Probably, yeah. Probably because new cat is actually, it's being created as an object. So I'm going to go over to my add cat form. And instead of doing that, I'm just going to say cat title. On add cat, just pass in cat title. Like that. We're not going to create an object out of it. Yeah, that would make sense. And then new cat here is just going to be, I mean, yeah. To be honest, we have this function here that's just calling a different function with the same exact variable. We really don't need that, but whatever. New cat title. Gonna call that new cat title, new cat title, and let's try it. New cat. I should have had my network tab open. New cat. Hey, it looks like it worked. Okay. Headers, post, status code, okay, payload. So this is the payload is what we sent. This is what we got back. So Airtable sent us back the cat that we just created with the ID that it generated for it. So this cat, that was successful. We just added that cat to Airtable. So Nihal, you are the MVP here. That was awesome. So I bet if I reload this, I'll have new cat in here. Yep, look at that. Okay, so now we're making new cats. And now the one last thing is it's not showing up. It's not re-rendering our thing. So I'd say what we want to do is after I do this, I get the response. I get the yeah, let's see. Oh no, I'm getting that same error again. Okay. New cat, send. And then this is the response we get back when we add a cat. So even though it's not a GET request, we're still getting a response with some data, and the data we get back, the like traditional way that a server will work is when you do a post request and you add some data, they'll send you back the version of it that got added to their database, because there might be metadata that's added, like the created at date or the created time or the ID that they auto generate for it. So we're getting this cat back that is their version of what we just sent over. It's the one that is in their database now, because we only sent over a thing with the title, and now they're sending back, here's your thing with the title and the other things that we added for it. So we're getting back this data that's our new cat, which is awesome. And when we get that back, oh, it looks like we are actually loading it down there. Oh, that's because we probably reloaded the page. But anyways, what we're going to do with this data is we're going to say set cat list to cat, or wait, do I already have a function for adding a cat? Post, remove cat, set cat to filter cat. Oh, okay. Okay, so we're going to set cat list to itself. So let's say previous cat list, cat list. We're going to set it to itself with all the previous cats spread like that. And then we're actually going to do const new cat, which, do I already have a variable called new cat? No, I don't. Perfect. Okay. New cat equals data dot records 0, And this time our records is only going to ever have one because we're only posting one cat at a time. And it's going to send back that one that we got back. New cat equals data dot records 0, or actually we're going to have to filter that just the same way as this. There's going to be a slight difference, but it's going to be mostly the same. And actually the map would still work fine for that. Okay, so we're going to do cats equals that, but it's actually just going to be cat, and it's actually not going to map through it. Yeah, I'm not going to use a map. I'm just going to say cat equals title and ID. The title is going to be data dot records 0 dot fields dot title, and the ID is going to be data dot records 0 dot ID. New cat. And then we're going to set the cat list to the previous cat list with the new cat in it. And maybe we could put the new cat at the start. I think I have my CSS in a way that like the cats overflow the page, and I don't have it so you can scroll to see more. Maybe I'll change that. Overflow. Yeah, overflow hidden. Okay, now I should be able to scroll to see new cats. Okay, so yes, we have new cat. Oh, wait, there's something else that's not. Or wait, overflow. That's not solving it. Oh, maybe I have a max height set on something. Anyways, we could just remove some cats. So I'll just try adding a new cat from the start. I'll say new cat or cool cat. There we go. So basically what that did is I'm adding a cat. It sends the request to the Airtable to add. Then Airtable, if it receives that request and fulfills it, it adds the cat. Then it sends back its version of the cat with the metadata it added, like the date or the time and the ID and stuff that it auto-generated. So then we get that response. And now with that new cat that we just added, we create a new, we set our cats to a version of itself that has the new cat at the end or at the beginning or wherever. So I could say new, and that's why there's a little bit of loading time in between when I add it and when it shows up, is because we're waiting for the server to actually add the cat and then respond with the data so that we can load that new cat in. And that is what's called pessimistic rendering. They say it in here. This approach called pessimistic rendering. So we're waiting to ensure that we have good data to work with before we update the user interface. We're not assuming the API call is going to be processed to the server 100% of the time. I encourage you to take this approach first and do some research on optimistic versus pessimistic rendering. So yeah, we're doing that. We're waiting to make sure that the cat is added to the database before we add it to our cat list. So cool cat 2. And there we go. And if I reload, it should show me all of my cats, even though I removed them. So removing cats, that would be a whole other thing where we'd need to like send another fetch request to Airtable to remove a cat. But for now, let's just leave it at that.
Doesn't work for remove, right? You would need to make a delete request for that.
Yeah, so you could delete the cats locally still, but we would need to. And also another problem with this is, let's see, filtered cats, cats, the ID, cats list, cat ID. Okay, oh yeah, actually removing it locally did work. And I know that because I did it, right? I was removing cats. It just doesn't remove it on the server. Nihal is getting a message. It's been blocked by CORS policy. Request header field body is not allowed by access control. Allow headers in pre-fight response. Oh, yeah. So the body should not go inside the header. So you have headers with that, and then you have the headers object ends, and then you have the body.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay.
So will this video also be on Slack for us?
On what?
On Slack?
Yeah, I'll post this in the YouTube, or I'll put this in the end. I'm gonna have to do some editing to this one because I have like my API key in there and stuff. So
Oh, it's all good. Thank you anyway.
yep.